Welcome back to the second International Web Effectiveness Podcast episode, where Bill Hunt and I, Bill Scully, focus on the strategies and the techniques necessary for ensuring that your web presence serves all stakeholders globally. In our last episode, episode 1, we discussed the frustrations of international SEO and HREFLang implementation. In this episode, we're going to chat about multi-regional domain structures. But first, we've got a bit of news. Google recently announced that they are using AI to add an additional 110 languages to Google Translate. Bill Hunt, how do you see this having implications on international SEO and HREFLang?
I think for most people, it won't be any problem. Google now translates 240 languages. Interestingly enough, only 107 of them have an ISO 639 two-letter code for the language. So that means I think there's like that 107 aren't going to have a code that you can use with HREFLang. Google's pretty specific that they don't use the three-letter code. The thing with these, most of these are actually lesser spoken languages and definitely languages that aren't going to have a problem being duplicative with something else. It's not like English or Arabic. So I think it's great news for the community at large. I think localizers are going to be able to tap into this, especially with some of the AI tools that Google offers. But I don't think it's going to cause us much problem or give you necessarily a benefit with HREFLang.
Okay, cool. This Google Translate is part of their AI?
I believe it is part of it's definitely part of the website translation. And then the other is you can, go to Google and drop it in and it will tell you. And then I know as a user of the Google Pixel, I got a note that these languages are now, native in my Pixel phone when I use Google Translate.
Wow. And for those that don't know, the Google app that you would add to the website, does that have any SEO value?
I'm going to say no. And that's actually something that frustrates a lot of people who had that put in or added it themselves and want to know why. We get this a lot with, hey, I've got 47 versions of my website now, and none of them are showing up in Google. And Google even tells you when you use it, that little plugin, that those pages technically don't exist. And if you watch your URL, the URL doesn't change, even if you click all 40 versions that you set. So those are just sort of dynamically done on the screen, and they're not done on an actual web page themselves. So if you're hoping that's going to give you pages for Germany or France, it's not going to happen. You could copy and paste that and drop it in, but natively out of the box, it's not SEO or international friendly.
And I would not highly recommend taking a straight translation from any machine translation without having someone that knows the language check it.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. So moving on. So to the main topic, you and I were talking about one of our pet peeves, the oversimplification of domain structures from an SEO point of view. Everyone's got a strong opinion on this, and this falls right into the reason of why to why. And this goes beyond SEO, why companies may not follow the standard SEO convention. It's a continuation from our last episode in which infrastructure chaos was one of the major challenges. And while we were planning this, you shared a research report from the GA agency. We haven't had a chance to share our thoughts, but can you describe that to our listeners and tell us what you thought?
Yeah, it's actually a really solid and well done study. Dan Wood from the GA agency, they partnered with SC Ranking, and they analyzed, I think it was 20,000 keywords across 15 different markets, predominantly Europe, and I think they threw Japan in there. I think they looked at 1.7 million SERP positions. And at the end of the day, it was a mix of e-commerce words, across the different thing. Interesting, what they found was that the majority, 56%, were using ccTLDs, so country code top level domains. And then 20% were using folder, so a gtld, a .com or a .co or a .tv or one of those, with country language folders. So it's probably the most comprehensive study that's been done on this. And so, it got some press. I actually first saw it when it was in Search Engine Land. And I think, like I said, I think it was well done. I really wanted us to flag it and talk about it because of exactly what happened, with both of us, where people reached out and said, hey, look at this study, 56% or the majority of the sites ranking predominantly in Europe are using ccTLDs. Should I pivot over? Should I move from what I got today into that? And I want to give Dan and his team a lot of credit for their summation at the end of the Search Engine Land article because, they didn't take sides. To me, this could have been an amazing piece of clickbait, you know, stating this, that the majority have it, and therefore that's how you should pivot. And in our show notes, we'll actually have their exact statement. But he basically, or the team goes on to say, the data supports those that advocate for ccTLDs, having a .de, a .co.uk. But he does specifically, and again, where I found this to be totally on point is that just remember they require more resources to build, maintain, and optimize than other options. They do talk about an interesting scenario with Switzerland, and I suspect this is similar with Belgium and maybe Morocco, where there's, other dominant languages, where he said the Swiss market tended to use subdomains, which was interesting, for the French and Italian and German, depending on what region you're in. And then they go on to say that while subdirectories weren't the dominant, they was still fairly commonly used. And at the end, whatever you start with, whatever you want to use, just make sure it fits into your whole strategy. And I think that's the key thing we want to talk about today, is you alluded to, and Dan in their article said a lot of almost everything that's out there is the same tired story, and written from an SEO perspective, why you should use one of these methods, not use one of the methods, and no context behind it. And I think, this research sort of supports a lot of those articles, but, I wanted us to try to talk about some of the reasons why people may be using one or the other.
Yeah, I think that's a great continuation. Before we do that, I agree the article was really well done, really focused on the data. I would have some questions for him, like, this was focused on e-commerce keywords. Do people mostly click on local e-commerce websites? Does Google show local e-commerce because of location? And, could you take a look at those sites? Were they global sites, or did they happen to be the local site that, does a better job at SEO? So I don't know if you picked up any of those answers in the article. I would have those questions if you didn't.
No, they didn't. And I mean, some of the big question I picked up was when he talked about Portugal, that Portugal was predominantly global, .coms. And they interviewed a local SEO, and she said, in her opinion, that was due to the small number of native companies, companies from Portugal. And for whatever reason, there wasn't as many. So, sort of the global carpetbaggers came in and were taking up search results. But I think this brings up a really interesting point that I flagged as something I'd be curious, like you, local brands versus multinational. Are local or single market brands inherently more local? Because everything they talk about, hey, we're in this town where, it's all local, local, local. It's not like, Nike or Adidas or somebody that, they're trying to get the same content out across 100 market sites versus this one that's all about them inherently being local. Is it that one has more resources, one knows SEO better? And I did call out one thing I saw, because with HREFLang Builder, we have a helmet client. And I was curious when I looked up, to her point, what were some of the big companies? The one thing I want to comment with this, it came exactly to your point around e-commerce. the number one maker of helmets, especially when I searched for their name in Portugal with my VPN, the first four, they were number five for their brand name. Number four were e-commerce sites. And I think that was because people probably want choice. Even when they put in their name plus helmets, you would think that the brand would get that. And I think I remember Rand gave this a name. It's like maker something, basically saying that people who make stuff are often demoted below the people who sell their stuff. I was like, I don't know, not maker conundrum, but maker something. And it was just really interesting. But what I found with that Portuguese company, going back to my point about resources, their Portuguese page, their homepage, for the fact that they're the largest manufacturer of these helmets, all of the key SEO bits were in English. And I thought that was strange for a native Portuguese company to have things like helmets, the titles, the headings, those type of things. Even though their homepage title was motorcycle helmets and highly technical, high technology helmets. It was just interesting. So I think it could be a combination of, they make helmets and they don't necessarily do SEO. They may not have a lot of native competition. So I think that was just interesting. So I agree, when we do our write-up for this research, there's a whole list of questions I think we should give Dan and his team to see if maybe they found it and it wasn't included, or maybe as they do a revision to this, they might be able to find some of these things.
Hey, this is Bill Scully. I just wanted to let you know that we have a free training course called Demystifying HREFLang. It includes 6 modules and is over an hour long with a quiz at the end of each module. You can find it at internationalwebmastery.com. Hope to see you there. Now, I don't think there's a lot of research on ccTLDs, but in your opinion, don't you think that they will be more difficult to rank outside the country?
Oh, totally. Because, inherently, and I mean, Google, and Dan also references Google's recommendations. For the reason everybody recommends ccTLDs, they're native to a country. A .de is Germany. So it's like, okay, this is a site for Germany. If they're a one market company and somebody does a search for them outside, should they rank outside of Germany? Maybe next door in Austria or down south in Switzerland, but should they? And that's the interesting dilemma with this, which is why people end up stacking them. They'll get, a .com maybe for the US, or because nobody uses .us, but it's an interesting thing. It doesn't hinder them from doing it, but it inherently says, hey, this is registered in Germany, for Germany, by Germans, for Germans, all of those. It's an insanely strong signal. And I think, a question I'd have for you is, some of the companies you work for, have been foreign companies. I mean, your experience with Siemens, they're a German company. So do they do a .de because they're a German company and then say, we're going to stack everything off of DE? Or do they say, hey, let's take a global view of this?
It's been a while, but they were really smart in governance and controlling. So there was a corporate site, and then there was, in some cases, there was actually regional sites. But what they were moving to when I was there, and what worked really well for us, was basically folder structure. So we had a .com with the different division, and then the different countries in some cases. And if you don't do that, then it's just a complete nightmare trying to put together HREFLang. It's like the Wild West. Like, everybody decides what the folder structures are, what the file names are. It's really, really, really difficult to make any matches. Which
I think those are great points. That uniformity starts from the top or from the first site, and it scans out. And that's one of the key things we want to talk about. Is you nailed it with governance, which interestingly is our next session. Is we're going to talk about, how do we get people to comply with this. And then we've also wanted to talk about today is why do companies, why do they go one way or another? Why do they, and you mentioned that, in this case, Siemens had been using folders for that uniformity, for ease of management, for, enforcement, and all of these things. And I think that's a key reason. In our discussion, we talked about three or four, of these, and they really break down into two or three key buckets. The first really being costs and overhead. And those are two really big buckets. And the second is exactly as you said, uniformity, forcing compliance. If you have the same structure and the same format, then you can launch a template with relative URLs and plug it and play in any market,
Yeah.
and everything just works. But circling back to the first one, the costs, I've had companies tell me in my experience working with companies making these decisions, and these are bigger companies, it's between 100K and $1 million per market to have ccTLDs. Even somebody smaller, and we're not talking about registering the domain but it's everything from hosting, security testing, it just everything adds up. But the licenses, when you launch a .com on AEM or Shopify or something, they treat that as a separate instance.
Yeah.
And so companies are like, wow, okay, how do I save $1 million or $2 million or $5 million?
And
Uh,
every reporting tool and every font and every yeah.
Plugins. If you're one of these, bigger companies or mid-sized companies that's using WordPress in 50 markets, every ccTLD is now technically a separate domain. So you need 50 Yoast license, you need 50 analytics license, and it adds up. And I think these are often, and this is sort of our pet peeve is a lot of times SEOs will come in and tell people from their education, experience, whatever, you need to pivot to this and not necessarily understand the complexity on the business side from a cost. Should you license your domain name? Absolutely. Because if you're starting out and you think you're going to go abroad, the moment you think you're going to go abroad, license that domain. You may not use it, 301 redirect it, 302, whatever you want to do, but get those, because the moment you have any traction or success anywhere in the world, somebody's going to squat that domain.
Yeah, and I think it's I mean, I haven't really weighed the exact value of having a single site with a country code versus a .com, but the cost to go from the country code to a .com can be avoided if you could start with a .com.
Absolutely. And that's what we're saying is that, one of our recommendations at the end of this is just sit down and plan it out. You may not be thinking today about global domination, but what's your plan if you do? And then, in our next part of this, I want to talk about URL structures, and we'll get there with some thinking on this. But I think the third reason people struggle with these challenges is acquisitions. They'll acquire, they want to extend in Latin America or Scandinavia. And so they'll buy a brand and they've got totally different structure. And you talk about, the challenge with HREFLang. With HREFLang Builder, I think I mentioned this last time, we had to account for 87 different formats of just how people designated the country and language, which is insane.
So,
And
so describe, I'm familiar with some of the formats you had to create, but describe some of the things that would be easily understandable in audio.
yeah, so somebody that has, let's say one market is .de, and then there is no language folder. It's just DE and all the URLs are .de. And then you have Austria that has the .at, and then they put, because maybe they have a German and an English, they add a /de folder for language. So now we got to figure out what is the same equivalent. And then you've got places like they've got a .com, and then they'll have a .com with a folder for language. And then the crazy ones are people that have business unit, category, product category, and then fifth, sixth, or seventh folder deep might be language or country. And these are the nuances. And we in our training, we actually show examples of people that have, I mean, to me, I've seen it's fairly common if people have 4 or 5 or 6 of these variations simultaneously. So, if you have that, you got to live with it and try to think about ways that you can centralize and normalize. And these are all methods we'll talk about next time in our governance discussion. But just think about it as you're going abroad, thinking about going abroad, if you are abroad, if you do an acquisition, start to think about how this should be organized and where the economies of scale and benefit can be received.
And beyond the structure itself, just having a ccTLD doesn't guarantee that pages will rank in the right countries.
It does not.
No,
It's a
nothing to
very
do.
strong signal, and you still need hreflang with ccTLDs, but
Yeah.
it's a strong signal, but it's not the only signal.
And once you have cross domain, it just multiplies the difficulty to build your HREFLang, like especially on page, but it'd be easy to do in a sitemap, but that's a lot of work to do and maintain and audit.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
So the one thing I had was so let's say somebody saw this report and this is and said, hey, I want to go exactly the scenario that we had where people were asking us, should I go to ccTLDs? So there's at least 2 questions you want to ask them. Number one, how many phrases are you not currently ranking for? So if you're not ranking for anything, then okay, we might think it's a ccTLD problem. But if you're sort of doing relatively well with your rankings and traffic and sales across the markets, you don't have a ccTLD problem. So it would be almost insanity, to rip out what you have, risk not, sending all the equity over to the new iteration for the sake of doing this, because there's a report that said, hey, all the other people have it. The second one would be if you don't have a ccTLD structure today, why is that? Is it because of cost, overhead, uniformity? Your brand guidelines are non-negotiable that say you must use the ccTLD. Do you have legal requirements? Because a lot of companies have these brand agreements or licensee agreements that they must use one or the other. So ask those 2 questions before you start ripping out the plumbing and going one direction or another. So let's now extend our discussion into the broader web infrastructure. So we talked about domains, ways and reasons people do that. We talked a little bit about URLs and some of the benefits of having consistent structures. And from what we talked about last time, URL structures were really one of the big challenges. And you alluded to this. How do I match it, especially on ccTLDs for HREFLang? I see too many companies do not have any rules or guidelines or anything. Markets are free range. They can do whatever they want. They can name it whatever they want. And this creates, as you said, not only problems for HREFLang, for analytics, technical SEO, and it makes it really hard to scale. You mentioned some of the governance and things you've had at other companies, but that was in a broader thing. Anything specific from your experience relating to managing URLs and templates? And do you have any tips and recommendations for people, to start thinking about this before we get into governance next time?
Sure. So first, I'd say governance will make your life so much easier. Probably win you an award if you could get it implemented versus not getting it implemented. I would say that all URLs should be within the same language, English. That way you can match things up. Starting from the domain, you want to use the proper country and language in the first folder. And then from there, you have governance around the company is usually the same company in every region. There might be smaller parts of the company in a region, and you could dictate what those folder structures would be, which dictates the navigation. And don't let people deviate. I mean, that's why you need the governance. Because once somebody makes one little change, it just messes everything up. Then you can't compare analytics across countries. You can't compare analytics. So companies need to think about their global footprint and how you deploy the components of a website. And you need to determine if there's a real reason to have different formats. I would say there's very few reasons to have different formats. Another one would be uniformity across market sites, not just creative and brand, but the URLs, the images. I mean, if you could standardize on images, you could use an image across all the markets, one image, and you could save yourself having, depending on the site, 50 different images, all that might need to be replaced just because you had a label change on a product. That is time savings, it's a cost savings. You want to make sure you have uniform scripts, and if you can, pull images all from the central location. The third thing, and this more up your alley, SKUID, a global SKUID. Develop ways to roll up information on performance, sales, and trends for a product sold globally. Amazing insights can be found in a market that can be transferred.
Yeah, I think that's critical. I remember I was in a meeting for a company. We were in Japan, and then we had the US team was listening in, and we saw this huge spike, and the meeting was in Japanese. And so the US team, we sort of would paraphrase it to them, and that manager, yeah, he saw the spike in this one particular set of words, and he's like, well, what was that? What did they get the lift off of? And we explained it. It was this particular new feature that had been explained a little more clearly and really surfaced in Japan. And then he had this epiphany. Oh my God, wonder if we, surfaced that feature the same way in other markets. And it was just fortuitous that he was on the call and he thought that way. And it is interesting how many people can't even roll up at a SKU, like this shirt. We might sell this in 50 markets, but it could have 50 different SKUs. So having a global ID, not only selfishly me from an HREFLang standpoint that we can bite into, but I always advocate around analytics. And we find that people, when you introduce this, which is a funny thing, it's like, oh, wow, this eureka moment that we never thought of having a global ID. But when you position it from analytics and they can see global insights, I think that's really how you get on somebody's calendar, is that type of thing. So, do what you need to do in the markets, but try to pin them down to get that global SKU. So.
And we've spoken in the past where you've come up with some really creative ways to pull that right out of a page to build the HREFLang.
Yeah, a lot of times it's in analytics, right? I mean, that's why we advocate in analytics, because in the analytics string, it'll be the local product ID, and then in most of the time they just simply add a GPID is what a lot of people call it. So with HREFLang Builder, we can ping the page and scrape it out. A very clever thing that OnCrawl did is they can run this XPath extraction for you when they're scanning the website, and we can take a feed from that XPath, through the API. So we've got 3 or 4 people that are using that when they introduce the global ID. So, or, can be as simple like a blog post. We tell people you can dump in a free, I think it's a meta tag ID plugin. It's free. And then you can have your translation or localization team, when they localize it, they just put in the same ID that was on the main language. If it's a US one, let's say, whatever the ID is on the US page, they dump that into that meta tag on the localized version. So that gives you a common tag. And again, it's great to use it from, any crawler. You can extract it. You can also use it for analytics, and you can use it for even some things like using product IDs, or even on templates. Another thing you can do is use a template ID. And that's a great way to catch people that are compliant by saying that they're on template 14 and you're up to template 43. So you can gig people for being out of sync with the current core template. So very interesting ways. And again, leverage somebody else's KPI to get this done, because nobody's ever going to do it for HREFLang, and very few are going to do it for search. So analytics is the way to go.
Yeah, analytics and performance managers, people looking at the numbers. Okay, great. So we're out of time. Do you want to give a wrap up?
Yeah, I think of all the things we talked about, the three key takeaways are understanding that there might be other reasons why people are using their current domain structure. And if it's working, keep working it. If it's not working, then obviously you have the grown-up discussion that we talked about earlier. The big takeaway I think that you gave us is really be aware and consider the global ecosystem and infrastructure and add in elements and scale. I think that was a really rock solid point. This allows local teams to do things that have more of a local impact rather than re-engineering things that don't. Lastly, try to enforce or at least encourage some level of consistency across markets and advocate the advantages of doing so. And next week, I think when we talk about governance, we're going to talk about some clever ways that we've used, to either sneak governance in, encourage governance, enforce governance, whichever way, carrot or stick, that you can do it, and ways to start small. And as Bill, as you've already mentioned, some of the benefits of doing that. So those are the big things I took away from today, and look forward to hearing from other folks what they got from it or things we should cover related to this topic in the future.
Yeah, that was a great wrap up. And I just want to add that, we're talking about one little tiny specific thing about international web marketing. And what we're really trying to get to in the end is increase in leads and sales. And just having a URL structure or just having a governance isn't going to make that happen. And what we're hoping to do is to cover all of these topics in the future to help you look good and make your company successful so that you become successful. And with that, I want to thank you if you've listened to the end. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. You can find us on the most popular podcast locations. And as Bill said, next week we're going to talk more about international governance. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks.
Hey, this is Bill Scully. I just wanted to let you know that we have a free training course called Demystifying HREFLang. It includes 6 modules and is over an hour long with a quiz at the end of each module. You can find it at internationalwebmastery.com. Hope to see you there.